This episode, and every episode in fact, is brought to you by my Patreon supporters. If you enjoy these videos and want to find out more about how you can support the show too, check out the link below or at the end of this video. And I thank you ahead of time. Let me start by saying I got the idea for building my workbench this way from Mark Spagnuolo from The Wood Whisperer, and a video that he made about 10 years ago about building an outfeed table that he made for his table saw. He definitely goes into more detail than I do, so I'll put a link to his video in the description. Anyhow, as you're probably aware, prior to this video, I already had a perfectly fine workbench. So you might be wondering why I'm replacing it with a plywood workbench. In fact, a lot of you might be thinking it's a downgrade, and you could probably make a pretty strong case in support of that. But at the end of the day, while my other workbench was fine, I think this will be better for me, and will allow me to do a few things that the other one just didn't. I'll explain my reasoning a little later in the video, but for now, let's get to work. So to build the workbench, I'm going to be using one full sheet of Baltic birch plywood and a bunch of remnants from the plywood dining table that I made a couple videos back. I started by breaking down the full sheet and basically roughing out my top and shelf pieces. So this required doing one long rip the entire length of the sheet, and then one big crosscut. After that, everything was small enough that I could do the rest of it on my table saw. I started by cutting some large panels to length so that I could rip the pieces and then not have to worry about cross-cutting each of them to length individually. Then I cut out a bunch of leg pieces. I needed 8 total. And then I ripped the rest of the material to make a bunch of stretchers. In total, I needed 4 long stretchers and a bunch of short stretchers. I didn't even bother counting how many of the short ones I needed. I just made as many as the remaining material would allow. The short stretchers had to be cut to length on the crosscut sled, but by the time I finished that, pretty much all of the pieces were cut out and ready to be assembled. I started off by gluing and screwing my 4 legs together. Once assembled, they form an L shape that's about 3 inches by 3 inches. And since I was using a butt joint, that meant that one of the pieces had to be 3 inches wide, and the other is 2 1/4 inches wide. Next, I attached my stretcher pieces. Here again, it's pretty much just glue and screw. The only trick is that I wanted the rail to sit exactly the thickness of the plywood top below the top of the leg. So I just used this little offcut from the same wood to make sure that it would line up just right. After the 2 long sides were built up, I used some of the short stretchers to connect all 4 legs together. Next, I flipped the whole thing back to being right side up and headed back to the table saw to cut the top to fit. In the beginning, I made sure to leave these pieces a little big so that I could take a measurement from my finished base and then dial the top in just right. And thankfully, I got it right on my first shot. To attach to the top, I didn't use any glue, just screws. I want the top to be removable so that if it gets banged up after a couple years, I can just swap it out for a new one. Next, I flipped the whole thing upside down again and attached a bunch of cross stretchers to support the top. What you see me doing here is definitely overkill. You'd probably be perfectly fine with just 2 of these, but I cut a bunch, so it was either the workbench or the trash. Next, I took one of my other large panels. This one I purposely cut a little bit too small so that it would be easier to slide in, and attached it to the underside of the top. Again, this is overkill. You could actually get away with nothing here, but I wanted to have an easy time clamping pieces anywhere on the table, and this definitely makes it easier. That said, just putting a few thinner pieces along the perimeter would have done the job just as well. The last thing I did was attach another set of rails a few inches below the top to hold a shelf. I didn't show myself putting it in, but the piece you see here at the bottom of the screen is a shelf piece just sitting there. Once the rails are attached and I flip the whole thing back right side up, it'll fall and then sit in place. And that was pretty much it. Okay, so that's how I built it. Now let's get into why I built it. I'm not going to bury the lead any further. So the main thing that prompted this whole endeavor was that I'm getting a CNC router, and it's pretty big. And, well, my garage is pretty small. So I needed a way to nest the machine under something, and this was pretty much the only option. So I figured since I was already going to have to build something, I should just build in a couple other features that I thought might be useful. So the second thing that I like about this workbench is the really shallow shelf. Now I know you're probably thinking that you can't really store much on it, but that's actually kind of the point. Whenever I'm in the middle of a project, I always find that I set a bunch of stuff on my workbench that shouldn't be there. Lots of tape measures, pencils, work pieces that are in progress, clamps. Anyhow, I often find myself having to move a bunch of stuff around to get that next cut. So I'm hoping this shelf can be used as a sort of second surface. I'm sure it'll take some getting used to, but in theory it should be good. Next, I purposely built the bench about 1/2 inch lower than my table saw. That way when I'm ripping long pieces, I can throw a piece of 1/2 inch something, preferably slick, on top and have it just nice and flush. And when I'm not ripping long pieces, the other 98% of the time, the surface is lower and doesn't get in the way of jigs that use T-slots. And yes, I'm aware that people typically route grooves out that align with the slots. Anyhow, so that's pretty much it. I'm not going to sit here and say that this is a better workbench. It's just better for me, the things that I'm building and my needs at this particular time. And really, if there's one takeaway you should have from this video, it's this. When it comes to things like tools, cameras, cars, or pretty much anything, adjectives like better or good are all relative. That is to say, they don't exist definitively. So what's most important for me in a miter saw or a sander or a workbench oftentimes won't be the same things that are most important to you. If you still need proof, look no further than contemporary coffee mug declaration practices. I mean, statistically, we can't all be the world's best dad. But we can all be somebody's best. Special thanks to my Patreon supporters for your continued support and for enabling me to keep these videos coming. Again, if you want to find out more about how you can support the show too, click the Patreon link to learn more. And as always, no pressure.